Unit 1, the French Revolution, 1774 to 1814. The actual standards say, just say France, 1774 to 1814. But this is the time period of the French Revolution. All right, what were the causes and immediate outcomes of the 1789 revolution? So some definitions here, some contextualization, which you remember you have to do in the paper 2 question B. Sorry, there will be a lot of typos in this. What is an absolute monarch? An absolute monarch is someone who's absolutely in charge of the country. And the best examples from history are Louis XVI of France, who we're going to be talking about his descendant, and probably Peter the Great of Russia. Anyway, again, my PowerPoint kind of does its own thing. The first topic is the ancient regime, problems and policies of Louis XVI. And the ancient regime just means the old country, the way things were. Regime kind of refers to the old government. Okay, and there it is, the old system of government. France was a rather large country, not one of the largest in the world, but there were different regions, different tax systems, different customs barriers. Supposedly, it was very regional, France was. And supposedly the first person to ever use the word France, we're doing this for France, which literally means land of the Franks, was supposedly said by Joan of Arc. Anyway, just some vocab here. Real wages, not what you earn, but what you can buy. And real wages during this time were going down. So people might have been making more money, but they would have bought less things. Today in the United States, when we talk about, how bad inflation is or how well we're doing, it's not so much about how much you make per hour, but compared to how much you make per hour, how much is a gallon of milk, a loaf of bread, a dozen eggs. Eggs are a really big deal in the United States in 2025 while I'm recording this video. All right, so I just threw this in, explained to my students, you can have some fun and ask your grandfather, how much did you make? And it's like my first job, and I am 63, my first job was loading watermelons, a very rural job at age 13. It was just something I did over the summer to make a little bit extra money. I made $2 an hour. And so I don't know, Universal Studios, I read somewhere, is now paying $17 an hour. But $2 an hour back in the 1970s when I was a kid might have been better money than $15 in the 2020s. You'd have to do a comparison. All right, moving on here. There were social divisions in France. 80% of the population were poor peasants. Their agriculture system was very inefficient. And what happened previous to this time period was there had been some very cold winters and the crops died. So there was high food prices. And I don't know that many people were starving, but I'm sure some were. This is kind of setting the stage for what's going to happen with the French Revolution. The peasants were heavily taxed by the landlords and the church, and this was under feudalism. They had to do a bunch of things. They had to maintain roads for the lords. The lords could hunt on peasant lands, but the peasants couldn't hunt on lords' lands. And I grew up in a very rural area, and imagine today to a lot of you that does not seem to make much difference whether you can hunt or not. But a lot of people I hunted with hunted for food. They were really very poor, and they probably had a garden, but they hunted to supplement their diets with some protein. Many of these peasants had moved to the cities. This is before the Industrial Revolution, or really right when it's beginning, but there weren't really many jobs there. And unlike Britain, which at this time is starting to go through the Industrial Revolution, that's Unit 2 in AICE European history, there were very few factories. Bread was 75% of the poor person's diet, and you want to circle that, underline that, make sure you know that. There was some quote, I don't know who said this, that bread was the staff of life. These peasants were very jealous of the aristocracy, who lived well and paid no taxes. They were probably somewhat jealous of the clergy too, the Catholic priests, because they didn't pay any taxes well, at least the upper class ones. There were two types of nobles, sword nobles, who'd won their title based on some military feat they had done, or robe nobles, someone who did some kind of administrative position. The legal system worked against the peasants. This is kind of, just a painting of the time back then. Being a peasant was hard, back-breaking work. And so we're going to talk about Louis the 14th here and what I call a data dump. For those of you who aren't my students, I taught AP European history for about 18 years. And there's some people, I have a master's degree in European history. There's some people we had to study in depth, and Louis the 14th is one of them. He is not a major player in this story. Louis the 16th, his descendant, is a major player. But Louis XIV was known as the Sun King. He is the best example of an absolute monarch. He built the most famous palace in the world, Versailles, and he required his nobles to live there half the year. Here's some pictures of Versailles. This is the famous Hall of Mirrors, which will become important when we get to Unit 3, because this is where Bismarck is going to have the German king sworn in, the Kaiser Wilhelm I. It's kind of a humiliation of the French after beating the French in the Franco-Prussian War. More pictures of Versailles. Oh, here's the Hall of Mirrors. I guess that wasn't the Hall of Mirrors earlier, but maybe they both are. I don't know. I've never been there. All right, the church and the aristocracy. It was rich, owned 10% of the land, paid no taxes. It was over most of the education in France, and it was in charge and wanted to stay in charge. And just think about it. The peasants were overwhelmingly Catholic in France, and they would make donations to the church. I'm not trying to make you cynical or anything like that, but obviously the church, whether they did it for religious reasons or financial reasons or whatever, you religious people can take heart by what I'm saying, and so can you atheists. I mean, there's a couple different ways to look at it. It doesn't matter why they're doing it, but they want to stay in charge of education so they can raise the younger generations to believe in Catholicism, and whether they did that for the money or they truly believed it, I guess it doesn't make any difference to us right now. Most top members of the clergy were members of the aristocracy, and they were lazy and disinterested in religion and the plight of the poor. The lower priests now, what's interesting is some of them actually did pay taxes. They could not advance to the higher ranks, although a lot of them were very, very good at their job. And this is going to be very important later on. So if you're my students, you might want to highlight this. Later on, when push comes to shove, a lot of the lower level priests are going to side with the third estate rather than the second estate, because what did they do every day? They christened the new Catholic babies. They preached the marriages. They preached the funerals. They were very much entwined, just like in the United States today, with the lower classes. And here's, I'm going to just say that again. I'm not going to put the hierarchy on the board, but if I did, it would be something like the Pope is at the top. Underneath him is the cardinals. Then comes the archbishops and the bishops. And somewhere down the line is the parish priest. I am not a Catholic, but I do know they followed the same organizational structure, largely that the Roman Empire had followed. Aristocracy dominated France, owned 30% of the land, paid no taxes. Now, here's what I want you to notice. If you look up at the top, the Roman Catholic Church owned 10% of the land. The aristocracy, the nobility, owned 30%, and they paid no taxes. That's the first estate and the second estate. The third estate is everybody else. And the aristocracy dominated the church, the government, judiciary, the army. They were not conscripted. What that means is they did not have to join the military in a time of war. And the lower nobility resented the upper nobility, who were often at Versailles. This is a famous political cartoon. I guess it could show up in a paper one, but paper one this year is on Germany, not on France. But this is a picture I've seen, a painting. I've seen different versions of it. And the three people represent the three estates. And the nobility and the clergy are riding up top, on top of the third estate, which was everybody else, the commoners, also the middle class, doctors, lawyers. There were rich people in the third estate, but they were shouldering the burden and doing all the work and carrying the other two states on their back. At least that is the significance of this cartoon. All right, let's go on here. Louis the 16th in the parliaments, he was descended from Louis the 14th, but he was weak and vacillating. He was an absolutist, but the parliaments, they're the local courts. You need to know what that is, could help him or hurt him. And the most powerful of all the courts was the Paris Parliament. Only lawyers of noble rank could be on them, and they tended to look after their own. They looked out for their own interests. France was divided into departments, and some were led by intendants. This is this ancient ruling system called the intendant system. If you had AP European history, you are certainly familiar with that. All right, moving on here, pressure for change. Now, the Enlightenment comes along. It is known as the Age of Reason, and it began in France. France had great thinkers. They were philosophers, and the French spelled it just like we do, except the R was not there at the end, and they were called philosophes. They frequently met in these homes of the upper class, in these fancy rooms, and they had like dinner parties, and they got around to discuss politics, and these were known as salons. And what they did was they challenged established ideas, institutions, and social structures. And the first fruition of the Enlightenment was the American Revolution. And the French are paying very close attention to that, and they are going to have the second of these revolutions. The way we teach them in history is the American, the French, the Haitian, and then the Industrial Revolution, although it's a revolution of a different sort. The confidence in the French government was low. They'd lost a war with England, and a lot of these upper-class thinkers were disillusioned. This is a painting of a salon. By the way, I don't think it's probably that important on this exam, but if you get an essay on this, you might want to mention that women who did not have a lot of political power, although I don't know if I seen it, there looks to be a woman there on the left, a couple of them. Actually, I see some on the right as well. At 63, my eyesight is not that good. The women actually participated in the salons if you get an essay about women's rights. So they didn't directly have a lot of power, but they indirectly did. So here's the famous names you need to know. And if you get an essay on the Enlightenment, you want to drop these names. And if you don't know what these people stood for, just mention their names. The most famous philosophe of all is Voltaire. I cannot speak French, but his real name is like François-Marie Arouet. He's what I would call cynical. He was very, very witty. And I'm just going to do a little data dump here on him. He's got some famous quotes. And here they are. He said the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman, nor an empire. That's probably not that important for this class. Here is one that is, crush the infamous thing. And the infamous thing is the Catholic Church. His other one was, no religion is worth burning your neighbor over. Those are the three most important quotes that come to mind. He was one of these people that was witty and sarcastic and would be in one country, then he'd get in trouble and get kicked out. He'd go to another one. Similar in many ways to Karl Marx. Very witty. He's a hero to a lot of people. You might want to write this down. He was not an atheist. He's a hero to a lot of atheists, but he was not. He was a deist, which I should explain at some point in this lecture. And I think what you need to know about him is that he questioned authority. So he taught these people, hey, don't do anything unless you know the reason why. Montesquieu, who is very influential in the early American government, he's not, but his ideas are. He wanted separation of powers, or a system of checks and balances. In the United States government has three branches, legislative, executive, and judicial, largely based on the ideas of Montesquieu. Diderot was he worked with somebody else, and he published this thing. We would call it the encyclopedia, but theirs is spelled exactly the same. It's encyclopedia, D-I-E. And basically what he did, he got a whole bunch of smart people in their field to write an article on their subject. He put them all in a book and published it. And the interesting thing is Louis the 14th, the Sun King, the powerful one, he had copies of this, and he supported a lot of research these scientists did, but he would not allow his own people to have copies of the encyclopedia. Rousseau is famous for education. That's what you want to know with him, about people being educated. Quesnay, I don't honestly remember what he's famous for, but it's got something to do with economics. So if this is the night before the exam, you might want to get out your phone or your computer and Google Quesnay and see what he's famous for. It's got something to do with economics. I'm just throwing this in to make you well educated. John Locke was a famous English philosopher, and he said people have the right to life, liberty, and property. And in the American Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson quoted him because, Thomas Jefferson was an Enlightenment person, so was Benjamin Franklin, the two big famous intellectual players here. And somebody told Jefferson to change it, supposedly, and he changed it to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, but he meant property. And I like to teach my students, because I'm not the most politically unbiased person in the world, that's a little joke there, this is basically kind of the idea that the United States was this great capitalist country, or would be. Nobody really knew what capitalism was at the time, but that's where that phrase comes from. He's English, and he influenced our most famous Enlightenment person here in the U.S., Thomas Jefferson. Now, what were Louis XVI's his reaction to these attempts at reform? Okay, so they'd supported us in the U.S. Revolution, political and economic factors. They'd supported us, and they incurred massive debts. And I don't really remember what the chart was, but I'll do it right here verbally for you. So there was a war between the French and the British, called the French and Indian War. Happened here in the American colonies. We were English colonies at the time, and it started here. And both the British and the French had their armies over here. Well, after the British and the Americans won, the British and the Americans and their Native American allies beat the French, and the French Americans, I guess they're not really just Canadians, but the French Americans and the French allied Native Americans beat them. And after the war was over, the English raised taxes, the British raised taxes on the Americans, which led to the American Revolution. So the American Revolution was over taxes. Well, so during the American Revolution, the patriots, Washington and Jefferson and Franklin, all these guys, they wanted to win. So they asked the French for help, and the French scoffed. They're like, aren't you the same idiots that we fought 20 years ago in the French and Indian War? They said, yeah, but this time we're fighting against your enemy. And the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So eventually the French joined the American patriots. I say that because many Americans fought on the British side. They were known as Loyalists or Tories. But they fought with them. And so the French and the American patriots won, defeating England. And now after that, the French are now in debt because they borrowed money to help the Americans. And that led to the French Revolution. So the most important of these three wars is really that French and Indian War. Anyway, at some point, there was this guy named Jacques Necker. He was a Protestant. He's a middle-class Swiss banker, but for whatever reasons, he's a hero to the common people. People loved him, the upper class didn't. They didn't think he was up to the job, and he may not have been up to the job. But the national debt went way up. And the national debt, every year a country has a budget. The United States, every year we have this thing called a deficit. And that's how much money that we spent that year that we didn't have. We borrowed. You take all the deficits and add them together in surpluses, which is a year when we spend less than we bring in, which we haven't seen for 20-something years. Add those together and you come up with the national debt. And ours is somewhere around $36 trillion. Well, the national debt in France had gone up tremendously. So the king needs help paying this debt. So there was this group called the Assembly of Notables. And he called them to ask for help. And they really couldn't help him. They told him he was going to have to call the Estates General. And he was asking for help here. And what happens is, I'm going to explain this on the next page, but I may as well start now. There was this ancient system in France. We don't need to know when and where it came from, called the estates. And there were three estates. The first estate was the clergy. And a lot of people, whether they're religious or atheists, they use this mnemonic device. God or the church always must come first. That's how I remember that's the first estate. The second estate is the nobility. And the third estate is everybody else. So as you saw on the last slide, the first two estates, the clergy and the nobility, were exempt from paying taxes. So the lower classes, remember there's some rich people in there, doctors and lawyers in the third estate. They're paying all the taxes to support everything. So the king, because he has this huge debt, he needs to raise taxes on the first two estates. And that's what he was asking for help for. All right, what did this show? How deep their financial crisis was. Showed how how inefficient, how, I don't know what the word I'm looking for here is, how, I don't know, hate having this brain fart here on YouTube. It was not up to the job. I'll think of it inefficient. There was probably some corruption. They're incompetent. That's the word I'm looking for. And the people thought that they didn't really know where all the money was going there. So you have some unrest and uneasiness and unhappiness amongst the lower classes. And now you've got this massive debt. And they don't really feel like the people, the common people, the third estate, that they really understand what's going on with the king's finances. And so now this is all the things this shows. You know, if you look at the top, there's now real growing opposition to the king and his government. And they started demanding change and greater involvement in government. Now, you wouldn't think they would get it. They're in an absolute monarchy. But that's the story of the French Revolution. They are eventually going to get a greater say. All right, so anyway, I'm just going to start here, the beginnings of widespread revolt. Brienne is this guy that's in charge of finances. He tried to get some money, but they were afraid to loan it to him because they were worried that the French government would collapse. And that may seem to you impossible, but it happens all the time. Governments can't pay the bills. And so it's possible for you to loan money to a government, and usually they do pay you back, but sometimes they don't. Parliaments wouldn't help. And unless the king shared power with him, which he did not want to do. Remember, he's the descendant of Louis XIV, who famously said, they were talking about France being the state, and he just supposedly said, hey, I am the state. Napoleon later on is going to corrupt that. Someone's going to mention the revolution, and Napoleon's going to say, I am the revolution. So anyway, there's street protests. The leaders of the parliaments were put in the Bastille. We're going to talk about that later on. There's pamphlets being spread. Brienne eventually gets fired. In the middle of all this, you have, after all these cold winters, you have hailstorms damaging the wheat crop. And so they put Necker in the French government. Apparently, he'd been there before. Now, remember, he's probably not up to the job. And he calls the Estates General. And they had not met in over 100 years. And to show the wisdom of Louis XIV, he never called it. Louis XIV ruled for, I think he was the longest reigning monarch in French history, maybe in European history. And he never called it. And I always tell the kids, I coached swimming and water polo for years. I always tell my students that one of the worst mistakes I ever made was letting them vote on the slogan to go on the t-shirt, because kids were threatening to quit the team, which is pretty silly. If you're going to quit the team because you don't like the slogan on the shirt, you shouldn't be on the team anyway. I told my students, sometimes the worst thing you can do is ask somebody their opinion. Someone's going along happy, and then someone asks them, what they're upset about, and they start looking for things they're upset about. Then they decide they're upset. And that's exactly what's going to happen here. He calls this the Estates General. All right. And so what happens is, all across France, they have these elections. And the church is going to send so many representatives. The nobility is going to elect so many representatives. And then the third estate is going to elect. And no matter how many people they send, each estate only gets one vote. Now, this is very important. Likely to be a paper 2, question 1. I don't think it would be a question 2, but it could be. Or question B, whatever. But they show up with this list of things they're upset about. And it's called the Cahiers de Doléances. And they were asked what they wanted. And there, that's the illustration of my example. This is going to be a big mistake in whoever put these people up to this. Now, I could have spread this out. This is very important that you know this. What did the clergy ask for? Well, they didn't want any other religions. They wanted everyone to have food. They didn't want, they wanted the landlords prevented from charging high rents on the peasants and hunting on the lands. So in that respect, they're going to kind of side with the third estate. And they wanted the church to be in charge of all education, not just most of the education. Now, what did the nobility want? Basically, the king comes out of the nobility. They wanted the king to be the only person to make laws. They wanted the legal system reformed, no change in the tax system without the approval of the Estates General. You might want to underline that, because this is what's going to start the French Revolution. And they wanted fewer restrictions on agriculture and industry. And then the third estate, they wanted the national debt to be paid off. Remember, they're the only ones paying taxes. They wanted taxes to be shared equally, and they wanted the privilege, I'm sorry about my typing, the privilege not of hunting abolished. And they wanted a school in every town, and they wanted the church reformed. At the time, there was a lot of corruption in the church. Anyway, so they show up at this big meeting, and there's a lot of pomp and circumstance. There's parades. And here somebody painted this. These are the delegates to the Estates General. And they show up. I don't understand the seating system. The king presides over it. He's sitting on the throne up there. And anyway, they get there. Anyway, we've already talked about the Cowherd's Dedoliences. So it meets on May 5th, 1789 for the first time since 1614. I haven't done the years there, but it is over 100 years. And it's the closest thing they have to a national lawmaking body. And you notice here where I mentioned the Sun King had never called it, and I mentioned that I used several examples from my long teaching and coaching year. I'm in my 35th year of teaching, of times that I gave the kids a choice. I mean, sometimes it works out well. Sometimes it doesn't. Anyway, there was much hope there, especially among the Third Estate. Remember, they haven't had a say-so in over 100 years. And so they sent a bunch of middle-class representatives. I put middle class because there really wasn't much of a middle class then. So those of you who are middle class listening to this lecture, and probably most of you are, because that's the biggest class in the United States now, it would have been very small back then. And it would be what you would consider wealthy. In AP European history, we teach that to be considered middle class, you had to have servants. Anyway, the king showed up. He wanted money. The Third Estate showed up wanting to discuss reforms. Eventually, they have a vote. And the vote, they ask, hey, can the king raise taxes or charge taxes to the First Estate and the Second Estate? Now, most of the people are in the Third Estate, but they all get one vote. So the First Estate, the clergy say no. You can't raise taxes on the first two estates. How did the Second Estate vote? No. How did the Third Estate vote? Yes. 2 against 1. It does not pass. And the Third Estate is so upset, they schedule a meeting without royal permission at a tennis court. Now, one historian said it was a handball court, but I don't know that it really matters. And they go there and they meet and they sign this piece of paper called the Tennis Court Oath. Very, very important, likely to be an entire essay question all on its own. I've got it in capital letters on purpose. And what they decide there is they will keep meeting until they develop a new constitution. So they just decide, you know what? Heck with those other two estates. We're the majority of the country. We will start our own government. The Americans did it. Why can't we? And they changed their name to the National Assembly. Now, this is a painting of the Tennis Court Oath. And I always point is, not very high quality, at least on my screen here. But I want you to notice that there are a couple of priests, or at least one right up front. And whoever painted this, who probably was not there, did that on purpose just to illustrate. Remember those lower priests? Some of them did side with the Third Estate and against their own estate, the First Estate. All right. So what else is going on? There's hunger in the towns and the countryside. There had been a bad harvest. Necker warns the king to be careful. Again, I don't know why my PowerPoint does this, but tensions rise in France. Here's the things that are going on. The king refused to work with the National Assembly. He wanted them to come back and have the 3 estates. And here's what he does. He moves troops into Paris and Versailles. He fired the popular Necker. Now, remember, Necker was probably incompetent. And even the moderates now, the younger people who I guess in this situation we would consider the liberals, they begin to see the king as the enemy. The young people had seen him, the lower classes, the peasants, had seen him probably as the enemy for some time. The conservatives, the upper classes, they liked it because they had a good thing going. Why mess with a good thing? The moderates, who were kind of in the middle, began to kind of see the king as the enemy. And this is very similar to the Russian Revolution you're going to study in Unit 4. So how did the people respond? All right, so I'm going to pause it here and start this up because we're at the 30-minute mark. I'll come back with a different video.